Hello and welcome to the 2022 Boston College Arts Festival. I'm the Visual Arts Coordinator, Yifan Wang.
And I'm the Visual Arts Coordinator Assistant, Megan Cassidy.
And now you're listening to the Artist Podcast series presented by the Boston College Arts Council Office.
Hi, Maxwell. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me today.
Of course. Thanks for doing this. How about we start with a brief introduction about yourself?
So I'm a senior in MCAS. I'm double majoring in Neuroscience and Studio Art. I'm working on part 2 of my senior final art project right now and doing some large-scale paintings based off of the work that I'm submitting to the Arts Fest this year. Half of it is based off of a mural I did in the first semester, and one of the large paintings is part of the senior show that I'm doing in late May.
Yeah, so how did you get involved in the arts?
So I drew for many years growing up, but I never studied art seriously. It was more of just a creative outlet for me. And I began to take it a little bit more seriously at the end of high school, when I took more painting and serious academic drawing courses at Boston College due to the liberal arts curriculum. I wanted to fulfill the arts core in a way that would be more interesting to me, as I had done some drawing prior. And I started getting into painting and doing more collage-based things. And I decided to pick up the major because it was an outlet that was interacting in the more neuroscientific and more traditionally academic work that I was doing in my other major, and giving me an outlet to look at problems that I was dealing with from a different perspective or in a more creative way. So it was helpful for me in discovering myself and for widening my approach to different problems and projects.
So you mentioned that you, like you said earlier, neuroscience and studio art major. So how do you see those two majors like connecting with each other? Like how do you portray, I guess, neuroscience in your art?
My way of understanding any academic discipline is that there's a large rational, logical framework that builds an expert approach to it. And then you have a responsibility to learn all the information about that structure as you can. But once you get to the limits of that structure, as they're always finite, then there's this infinite room to explore and hypothesize, which is part of the scientific process. That we have all the axioms and the assumptions that we accept to be more valid than others. And then we build new things out of that understanding of what we already, quote unquote, know. So I use art as a way of exploring that space beyond what we know and beyond what I can understand with that more rational framework. And I think when I return to that structure, I can bring back with me something that's a little bit more abstract and something that can possibly add color and new features to the structure that I'm working with in a more scientific sense. So the interaction of the two brings out an interesting synthesis that I think would be impossible otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. So you submitted 2 paintings. How about we start with the first one, Asmodeus? I'm curious as how long that took you to finish.
Well, that was a semester-long project. It was an L-shaped wall, well, like this, and it was 25 feet long when it was stretched out fully, put tip to tip, and about 5.5 feet tall. So that was a semester-long project. It was acrylic paint, and not a lot of planning went into doing it. I wanted to do more of a style of painting, almost as a wall is done in graffiti sense, where people work on and tag it individually, and eventually over time, the larger composition emerges, and no artist is meeting with each other and working out that concept collectively. It kind of happens in the background, and then something interesting happens because of that. So I wanted to do that process more individually, where I don't have a specific plan in mind other than fill up X amount of space with paintings and abstract and representational imagery and allow that process to emerge by itself. So I started off with a couple icons and a couple figures that laid the groundwork, and then I filled out the empty space from there. If you keep doing that, almost like a fractal, if you get these regions that get smaller and smaller and smaller, you keep adding details, and eventually the whole thing is filled up. I could probably keep working on it now if I wanted to. It's just that you reach a point when you have to present, and that's when you stop working on it. And I'm happy with how it presented, but I could certainly see myself returning in the future and continuing to work on it, especially given the literary and artistic themes involved in the title with Asmodeus, the poem about the statue of the king found in the desert that had a story written on it about an empire, a once great empire that had fallen hundreds of years ago, and about how it would stand forever. And the irony of that being found in with a statue lost in the desert, covered in moss, that even the things that we consider might last forever, might be immortal, eventually decay. We continue to make attempts to make something that lasts forever, even though we know that's an impossibility, and that there is still beauty in that pursuit, knowing it has futile ends. So it doesn't really matter as much that there's a contradiction, as long as the effort's made to reach towards that goal, then something can come out of that process.
If you would go back, what would you add?
It depends how I set my intention before I want to work on it. Because before, when I worked on the initial mural, I set my intention as allow this to be a free space where you're not afraid to make mistakes, where you can cover things up and go back and change things. And you're not going to portray anything realistic or representational. You're not going to be working from reference materials, barring from a few things like the portrait, which references a German portrait painter from the early 1900s, which is on the left side of the mural, and the drawing of Dr. Manhattan, which is from the comic books that was I picked from the studio. And that's kind of the free associative process that spawned the mural in the first place. I had sat down, I'd been doing drawings for weeks, and I was like, I want to do a large scale thing, because I'd only worked on paintings that had been relatively small to medium sized up until that point. And I just produced a large quantity of them, but I had never made anything that was a large scale work. And many of my favorite things that I had seen in museums and galleries and other spaces, especially in the city, the large scale graffiti murals that were on the walls, especially in downtown Manhattan, were some of my favorite things. So I wanted a chance to replicate that myself, to contribute to that large scale artistic historical dialogue. But I didn't want to do anything that was too specific, because I hadn't worked in that space before. I wanted to allow myself to explore it without letting myself down, because if I had a particular goal in mind and I didn't reach that goal, then it would have felt like a letdown, and then maybe I would have been discouraged from ever working in a large scale space again. But the fact that I had no particular goal in mind, that whatever happened was what the project was going to be, allowed me an incredible freedom to just do whatever I wanted to do in the particular moment. And each of those individual moments built up over time into a larger narrative that took place over the course of the semester, which is why I think that period of time where I worked is going to be its own chapter if I decide to work on it again, because I would need to set a new chapter, give it its own title, and decide what intention I'm going to do. Maybe I'm going to completely remove certain sections of it. Maybe I would add oil paint or spray paint, or do physical, more structural things to it and make it a 3D surface rather than a flat image. I think it would be distinct from what that first chapter in working on it would be.
Yeah, there's kind of a beauty in that, not really knowing if it's finished or what you would add to it, or like what medium you would add to it. And it kind of takes on influence and inspiration like from graffiti art, and like I guess you could say like ephemeral art in itself, because it's gonna be changing. And that's beautiful like about it, because I feel like people think that art will always stay the way that it is.
And I think something very much related to what you just said is much of graffiti art, especially the one that isn't sponsored by art curators who own the buildings, that reach out to a well-known graffiti artist and say, do a large-scale painting. Those generally stay over time because there's been some contract that gets made. But the more off-the-books graffiti art, where people just go around at night and spray things on, there's sometimes very cool things that come out of that get covered because of just street sanitation and everything like that. But there's something cool about the fact that they appear for a couple weeks and then they disappear soon after. And that didn't happen exactly to my project, but I did have to remove it from the walls after it was done. And it left this big empty space, because the walls that were part of the space that I was working in were these large homosoap boards that are nailed into the structure of the building. and I had to saw those out and preserve them in my house and in some cubbies within the art house now. There's an empty space there where I can see the structural framing of the building. So there's a semi-permanent reminder to me of the process that happened there. And now that empty space is where I've been hanging up the paintings that I've been working on this semester. So where the positive space that I'm working in now is occurring in the negative space of what happened in the past. So I think there's just an interesting interaction that's happening, at least within the metaphorical and literal framework of where I'm working.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like it kind of shows that everything has a purpose or use. I loved how you put it, like the negative space of the murals now, where it once was, is now being used to hang your other paintings. And speaking of other artworks, you submitted another one called Untitled. What was the thought process behind this one?
This painting changed a lot from what it was initially, because I like what it was at first, and then I made a large change to it, and I also like what it is now. But I'm interested to see if I can make another painting that was more of how it was in its similar state and then compare them and as final products, because the original of it was more based on the biomorphic drawings of Joan Miro and Kandinsky, a lot of the kind of abstract expressionist, but less painterly, more drawing based geometric forms, but curvilinear structures within that as well. And then some references to possible living things. So it's not just non-referential. It has some basis in recognizable imagery, while kind of blurring that space a little bit. But then the fact that it was a large scale painting, I wanted to work with the background more, because many of the drawings that I had studied that I used as references for this painting were just pencil sketches or marker drawings in empty white space. And I wanted to take more advantage of the background. So I used blue and mixed that in with black in the background to fill there. And then I wanted to add more contrast, because the predominantly purple, blue, and light blue colors of the biomorphic forms of the central image were blurring somewhat into the black background. So I began to put in red and yellow into that, so there'd be some more contrast, so it would really be distinguishable from the space. The blue and there are these light blue areas in the bottom left-hand corner, and then the middle right area that I thought were interesting at first, but they were distracting from what was really happening in the background of the image. So I covered them with large black lettering shapes, because I was looking at a lot of shadow art and puppetry and things like that, and how the silhouette of something takes on a distinct form from the details that occupy the space within it, and how shadows themselves kind of occupy a space in a way that's very different than something that's full of details, because of just the fact that there's no color at all. And especially, I've been playing since the first semester. I used a lot of black to differentiate space that are full of color, and I used that in a lot of my current paintings, because many of my paintings balance many different colors within the same space, and black allows these structures that sit on top to emerge, which adds a illusion of depth, even though the images are generally pretty flat that I've been working with recently.
When you say biomorphic, do you mean like did you draw inspiration from kind of like natural forms, or what would you say is like the inspiration?
Well, a lot of the biomorphic art is just representational of things that occur in nature, but in a more abstract language. So it can have things that look like a neck, and then generally there aren't any rectilinear or hard edges in these forms. So everything is more rounded. And because in nature, even the most jagged of cliffs aren't perfectly straight most of the time, which is why when you see a perfectly flat surface in a natural setting, I feel like that generally has some response in the observer, because that's distinct. There's a lot of rolling hills. There's even mountains have edges, but they're rounded most of the time. So the trees, the fish, everything that you see, they all are not perfectly flat edges. They're all rounded.
Yeah. Wow. I never really thought of nature like that. That's really cool perspective. Is there a specific artist or artistic style?
So no matter what I do, abstract or otherwise. For whatever reason, I always return to portraiture. I've always been interested in painting people, and I've noticed that even my most bold explorations in abstract imagery are ultimately just used for the ends of advancing my development in portraiture and representing people, because I like to add more of an abstract aesthetic to to my color usage and sometimes the manipulation of the background. There's a Japanese painter who's my current favorite living artist called Densai Terazono, who's working out of Tokyo right now, I believe. Something that was exciting recently is I reached out to him on social media, and because he was looking for people to use for representations in his paintings. And
Wow.
I'm going to be sending him out some pictures this week to use as a reference for shoulders and above portrait painting. So getting to be involved in that process is very surreal and very cool for me. And I
Mhm.
feel like it's encouraging to work on more portrait painting, possibly do a self-portrait,
Yeah.
maybe even do a painting of him.
Well, thank you so much for your insight on your artworks and yeah, everything else. Thank you for submitting. Thank you for doing the interview. I hope that your senior showcase goes smoothly, and I can't wait to see what you do in the future. And that's so exciting that you're able to work with artists outside of BC, outside of the United States. Like, that's amazing. Yeah, I can't wait to see where your career as an artist takes you.
Thank you very much. I am very excited as well, and I appreciate you having me on this today to talk about my artwork and to talk a little bit more about the studio art department that has made this personal journey possible for
Mhm.
me. I think the arts can add anything can add something important to anything that you're studying or anything that you hope to study, and can make it a more exciting and creative process as you develop.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.
Bye.
Excited to see everyone there, and take care.
Yes, bye.
Bye.